Hello, class. This is your lecture on kingdom fungi. Let's get started. Your outline is as follows. First, we'll define the fungus, and then we'll talk about the ecology and evolution of the fungus. Then we'll break them down into several recognized phyla, but do know that the names of these phyla often change, so just keep that in mind if you go on with your biology education. First off, what are the fungi anyway? Well, first off, their characteristics include the following. They are eukaryotic. They are heterotrophic by extracellular digestion, which is to say absorption. Nearly all of them are multicellular and filamentous, but there are a few unicellular examples. Their cell walls are composed of chitin. They store extra carbohydrates as glycogen and lipids, and they reproduce by spores. Let's get a little bit more information about this idea of multicellular. Well, their bodies, when they are multicellular and filamentous, is broken down into the following: the hyphae and the mycelium. The hyphae is a single filament of fungal material, and the mycelium is several fungal filament strands all combined together. And by several, it usually means hundreds or thousands of these found underground. When you think about a fungus, you often think about the spore-producing structure. You might refer to this as a mushroom, right? That's often called the fruiting body. But most of what makes up that fungus is actually found underground. Let's get a bit more information about this item from our first list. They reproduce by spores. Here are a variety of spore photos from electron microscopy. The number of output of spores is enormous in many fungal individuals, reaching into the trillions. These spores are dispersed by wind, water, or animal, and sometimes by elaborate coevolution. The spore shape and ornamentation are taxonomically important in identifying the fungal groups. Now, these spores are the primary way that these organisms reproduce, and this can be either sexually or asexually. Now, for this course, we're not going to have to learn the details of the sexual and asexual reproduction of the fungus. But if you go on in another majors level biology class, you might need to learn these types of life cycles. Now let's say a few words about fungus ecology. There are some terms we can use to describe the way that fungus interacts both with living and non-living things. For example, some fungus are considered saprotrophic. This means that the fungus obtains nutrients from dead organisms or inorganic material. Therefore, saprotrophs are primary decomposers. Another group of fungus are called biotrophic, and as far as ecology is concerned, this means they obtain nutrients from living organisms and they form important relationships that are a part of a given ecosystem. Now, biotrophic organisms are also called symbiotic. It's a close long-term relationship between two or more organisms. We could break down symbioses into pathogenic, commensal, and mutualistic. And all three of these are seen in the fungal world. Pathogenic relationships are typically harmful to the host. For example, a fungus might hurt its host plant that it lives on. Commensal means the relationship is not harmful or beneficial to either of the partners of the symbiosis. And mutualistic is beneficial for both members of the relationship. In the fungus, we see a lot of pathogenic relationships. In fact, approximately 30% of all fungi are pathogens on other organisms. We also see a considerable amount of commensal relationships. One example would be called an endophyte, in which a fungus lives inside of another organism. For example, almost all plants have endophytes at least in some point in their life cycle, and we also find endophytes in at least 5% of all arthropods, which includes the insects. Mutualisms are some of the coolest relationships in the fungal world. For example, organisms such as lichen and leafcutter ants and termites all have interesting relationships with the fungus. One we've talked about previously is mycorrhizae. These mycorrhizae are essential for plants. These fungus live in, on, and around the plant roots and greatly increase the plant's surface to volume ratio, thus allowing the plant to absorb these nutrients more effectively. Just like the protist evolution is still being sorted out, so is the fungus to an extent. Mostly the issue is that we're constantly discovering new fungus. Such a tiny percentage of the fungus thought to be on our planet today have actually been identified. So as we identify more, it can shift how we place these organisms on the tree of life. However, it is interesting to note that the fungus do share a branch on the tree of life with the animals, not with plants or protists or the algae. The science of mycology began in around the 1700s, and it's been constantly changing as the decades went on with new and new information. Less than 100,000 species have been described in great detail, and we estimate that there are probably 1.5 million other species out there. Pretty amazing that it takes that long to describe such a diverse group of organisms. The kingdom fungi was created in 1969, and currently it contains 5 phyla, but again, this changes all the time. So now let's take a look at these phyla. And the first one is the chytrids, which is called the Chytridiomycota. This is the oldest, most primitive lineage of fungi, and these organisms are found mostly in the freshwater systems of our world, but some are found on the soil. Some of these are unicellular, and many of them are decomposers or parasites. One example of a chytrid is the one that causes the devastating frog pathogen that is wiping out amphibian populations around the world. Our next phylum is the Zygomycota, and this is named for the sexually produced zygosporangia, which is a thick-walled black overwintering structure. Members of this phylum include parasites, commensal symbionts, and molds. We often refer to members of the Zygomycota as the bread molds, but they are more diverse than that. These can be economically important. Some of these members are used in pharmaceuticals to make, for example, birth control and anesthetic medicines. They can also be used in food. One member is used to make the yellow pigment that is used in commercially produced margarine. Here's a cool example. It's called Pilobolus, and it has an explosive spore dispersal. It's one of the fastest biological movements that we've recorded. Each discharge of the spore is completed in less than 0.25 milliseconds, which is 400 times faster than you can blink your eye. The sporangium is less than 1 centimeter tall, and yet it can shoot this little spore 6 feet away. Pretty stunning. Our next phylum is the glomeromycota, and all members of this phylum are microscopic. It's ecologically and commercially very important. We get a lot of different foods and medicines from this group, and a lot of them form mutualistic symbiotic relationships with the roots of plants, including some of our key food crops. Our next phylum is the Ascomycota. These members may be found in habitats such as saltwater, freshwater, or terrestrial land-based systems. Members from this phylum are defined by forming a sac-like sexual structure called the asci, where ascospores are produced internally. They range in size from unicellular yeast to complex fruiting bodies like morels. Saprotrophic or pathogenic on plants, animals, and other fungi are just some of the ecological syndromes that we see in this organism. A majority of lichens are symbionts with members of the Ascomycota. Recall that a lichen is a symbiosis between a fungus and an algae, or a fungus and a cyanobacterium. Some Ascomycota members have mycorrhizal relationships, or some other ones are leaf endophytes. As I mentioned, there is a lot of ecological and human significance for this group, and here's some of the human uses. For example, truffles are a delicacy that are utilized in many cultures around the world. Interestingly, these truffles are underground, and so they have to train squirrels or pigs or even dogs to find them. Lots of edible mushrooms, such as morels and lobster mushrooms, belong to this group. We get baker's and brewer's yeast from this group. Cheese and food molds are often made from different species of penicillium. There's a variety of human diseases that can affect us that belong to this group. Medicine can be made, and then there's a lot of folklore and history that goes along with this group as well. Here's a very unique genus from phylum Ascomycota. It's called cordyceps, and it infects insects. It makes them basically go to the top of a tree where they die, and then all of the spores rain down on the ground to hopefully infect other insects. Our final phylum that we learned for this class this semester is the Basidiomycota, and they are defined by the formation of club-like sexual structures called basidia. Now, in these organisms, meiosis occurs in the basidia, producing special basidiospores. Around 30,000 species have been described, with many more unknown. Body forms of this phylum include rusts and smuts, guild mushrooms, boletes, shelf fungus, puffballs, coral fungus, and stinkhorns. And the ecology includes decomposers, parasites, pathogens, and mutualistic ectomycorrhizae. Rusts and smuts are very common plant parasites, so very relevant for a botany course. The mycelium invades the host and absorbs the nutrients, sometimes causing tumors. This is a cause of lots of crop loss and crop destruction around the world. However, some of these smuts are actually considered a delicacy. For example, corn smut can actually be consumed. When you think of a mushroom, most people think of a guild mushroom, but notice that guild mushrooms belonging to phylum Basidiomycota are just one small fraction of the fungal diversity. Some are poisonous, but others are highly edible. As a side note, you should never harvest mushrooms in the wild unless you are with a trained mycologist, because some look-alike mushrooms are deadly, even though they look like they're edible. Now, most of the guild mushrooms are ecologically very important, both as mycorrhizae and with their associations with other organisms, as well as for nutrient recycling and bioremediation. There are also a lot of pharmaceutical and medicinal uses used by many different cultures, including both Eastern and Western medicine. One member of this phylum is humongous. It's 2,400 years old and about 3.4 square miles in size. Some people consider this to be the world's largest, oldest, and heaviest organism, and it's all that mycelium growing underground. Some other cool examples from phylum Basidiomycota include boletes, which have pores instead of gills, and shelf fungi, which are often found growing on the sides of old logs, decomposing them quietly. Puffballs have very fantastic shapes, as do bird's nest fungus, both which have very unique spore dispersal tactics. Stinkhorns look like science fiction or aliens. They have co-evolved with many different spore dispersers. Typically it's flies and other things that like stinky things, but they come in and they get the sticky spores on their body, and then they disperse the spores. Finally, the lichens, which are mutualistic associations between a fungus and either a green algae or a cyanobacterium. The symbiosis evolved around 700 million years ago, and lichens are very diverse on our planet. There's over 3,500 relationships that have been described. The photobiont is the photosynthetic member in this relationship, and it provides carbohydrates. But the fungus provides the home as well as stores water. It allows these organisms to live in very extreme environments. In fact, many lichen are considered pioneer organisms because they are the first to occupy a new habitat, such as bare rock. Lichens are very sensitive to climate change and pollution. We often think of these as the canary in the coal mine because they die very quickly as conditions change. All right, so now we've covered all things fungi in this lecture. Please review the ecology, the evolution, the various phyla, and make sure to talk about the lichens in your discussion of this kingdom. That's it for this lecture. Please email me with any questions, and thank you for listening.